Sup guys, after testing a bunch of different fleets for the Bristol META fight, I have updated my seasonal tier list to reflect what I believe are the best ships for the fight. In terms of mechanics for this fight, the key ones are 1. Having an invulnerability effect in the fleet in order to remove Bristol's damage reduction, and 2. Having a vanguard that can survive the percent max HP drain as a result of having an invulnerability buff. Before we begin, I just want to bring attention to something that I only realized recently, which is that the RPG Adventure Interface auxiliary stacks if you use 2 of them on different ships. I had just mistakenly assumed that, like all auxiliaries with skill effects, they would not stack if used in the same fleet, but this is not the case at all. As long as you use them on 2 different ships, the effects do stack, except for the barrage, which is pretty much just a miss compared to the other 2 effects. For many fleets that have a high but not guaranteed chance to clear the boss in one fight, just proccing the stat buff once is enough to guarantee a clear, but with 2 of them, there is a greater than 50% chance of at least one of them proccing the stat buff. If you have access to them, you should by all means try to fit them onto your vanguard ships, which shouldn't be difficult since it just has a lot of HP, which is exactly what you want on most vanguards in a fight like this anyway. With that being said, let's get into the tier list. Starting with the main fleet ships, GVB and Lion are the 2 strongest ships for this fight. They just do the most damage, it's not rocket science. Although Lion typically contributes more total damage to the fight, GVB serves an important role in activating Trafalgar's self-heal twice as much as Lion or any other commonly used main fleet ship, enabling her to become the main tank for the fleet while providing much more damage than an actual tank would with her evasion rate debuff. Moving on, we have the usual suspects in Fitzrume and Alsace, the next highest damage contributors who have no issues working alongside Lion and GVB. We only have access to 2 Admiralty fire control tables, so you do have to use the gold high performance fire control radar on Alsace if you're going to be running 3 battleships together, but it's not exactly an issue as opposed to a symptom of OCD if you feel like there's something wrong with this. The final main fleet ship in S tier is Raffaello, who sacrifices damage compared to the other options to keep the Vanguard alive more consistently. She's a very good option if you have enough upgrades in terms of equipment, fleet tech, and oaths to reach the damage threshold of 1.6 million. Next, let's go over the vanguards. Bristol META has a 20% damage reduction unless one of your ships have some kind of invulnerability buff. So Eldridge is not only serving her usual role as vanguard protector and slower for battleships, but also ends up being one of the biggest contributors of damage in this fight. While it is possible to one-shot the boss without her, the success rate becomes much lower and I would not recommend it to anyone whose goal is convenience. Next up is Trafalgar, who, aside from her typical role of lowering the boss's evasion, can also serve as the tank in this fight. When Eldridge's Vanguard invulnerability buff activates, the ship in the tank position will continuously lose a percentage of their max HP due to Bristol's skill, which Trafalgar can offset better than pretty much anyone else by healing every time the flagship, who in this case is GVB, fires an attack. Over the course of a fight, GVB fires 8 times, healing Trafalgar for a total of 40% of her max HP. However, even with the support from GVB, it is still possible for Trafalgar to be knocked out early if Eldridge doesn't activate her skill at crucial moments, which is always a possibility. So the addition of Raffaello can mitigate that at the expense of some damage. Next up are 2 ships that I don't think many people might have expected to be this high. Both Howden Leu and Guam are relatively tanky ships that deal decent damage and slightly increases the damage dealt by battleships in this fight. Howden Leu increases HE damage, which should be all of the main guns used in this fight. The debuff lasts 9 seconds, and it activates about once every 9 seconds, so it's effectively a permanent increase. Guam applies armor break that lasts indefinitely, and while it doesn't stack with other sources of armor break, there is no other source in this case since all the battleships are using HE guns, and they don't have it in their skills or barrages. These minor buffs alone are not the reason I have them rated this high. Rather, they can main tank for most of the fight, long enough that if they do end up going down, which is not guaranteed, there is no chance of Trafalgar going down before the end of the battle. Similar to Raffaello, this is a way to ensure that the Vanguard stays consistent from run to run at the cost of damage that could be had from using a stronger ship like Plymouth or Chapayev over them. And from my anecdotal experience, the trade-off here actually seems to be better than using Raffaello in place of a stronger main fleet ship. They have almost identical roles, but anecdotally, Howden Leo seems to output more damage and survive longer than Guam, possibly due to some combination of factors like her minor heal and also my Guam not being oathed. Next up is Chapayev, who provides the most damage when used alongside Trafalgar, having a permanent 10% evasion rate debuff against destroyer enemies. The two of them add up to 20% evasion rate down, which is enough given the stats of the boss, so if you're going to be using either of them, then Aurora is not necessary. Next is Plymouth, who can be used as an alternative to Chapayev, since GVB being the flagship is powerful enough to make good use of her buff. Her total damage contribution is not as high as Chapayev's, but her survivability is better, so if you feel like Trafalgar is dying early, then Plymouth will have an easier time lasting until the end as the second tank after Trafalgar goes down. Next up is Z52, who can be used in a similar fashion to Howden Leo and Guam, but she ends up just being a little bit worse overall for this fight because she's just a little bit squishier, and dying early means that her total damage is a bit lower than what she's usually capable of, and her debuff isn't permanent like Howden Leo and Guam's are. The final ship in S tier is Aurora, because she alone still provides the highest consistent damage amp from the Vanguard, but she does need a lot of babysitting because she's quite squishy. She can find success sandwiched between Howden Leo and Eldridge, for instance. Now, I will take a moment to share some of my results having tested a bunch of different permutations of these S tier ships. All of the fleets were tested without the RPG interface auxiliary, so it's a bit of a lowball on how they perform when the RPG auxiliaries are used. In the first fleet, I used Z52 as the tank. This was pretty early on, so I didn't know that the rear slot would be the best for Eldridge. One of the runs didn't make it because the Vanguard wiped, which I think could be prevented by just moving Eldridge to the rear instead of the middle. The second fleet is a pretty generic one with Rume and Trafalgar. There's an average of 7 bars remaining as the last round of attacks out of 4 total rounds begin, so there is more than enough damage to one-shot the boss. But when Trafalgar dies really early, there's a chance of it failing. Using double RPG pretty much completely mitigates this. As expected, the damage here is better with Trafalgar over Z52. This is an improvement over the first fleet, but I think we can do better. Next, I ran pretty much the same fleet, but with Alsace over Rume, and the bars remaining before the last round of attacks was even lower on average. And even though all runs finished the boss, there were some close calls that definitely could have ended up in misses had they been even more unlucky, so it's not perfect. I also tried replacing Chapayev with Plymouth, but the damage was a bit lower like I mentioned before. After that, I tried using Raffaello in the main fleet, and the entire Vanguard survived every run at the expense of much lower damage on average, but still enough to finish the boss. This should pretty much be a guaranteed kill on the boss provided you have the same amount of account development as I do. The final fleet is when I decided to give Guam a go. This fleet felt as consistent as with Raffaello. One nice thing I haven't mentioned about Guam is that she applies her armor break as soon as the battleship in the top position fires, which should be at the beginning of battle if you're using Alsace. Therefore, she's still contributing with her armor break even if she dies a bit earlier than usual, unlike most other tanks like Z52 or Trafalgar, who might cost the fleet some damage if they die early due to unlucky Eldridge procs. As such, Guam is the only tank that I go Pearl tier on, since it's okay to plan for her going down. She can tank for long enough that there should be no chance for Trafalgar to die, since the fleet still has the GVB plus Trafalgar combo that is almost capable of main tanking, but we're conserving her HP until after Guam dies. I think it might even be better to use damage auxiliaries on Trafalgar instead, since she doesn't need the bulk nearly as much as when she's the main tank. I didn't record results with Howden Leo, but I'm running a fleet with her non-stop as I'm making this video to see if it fails at any point. So far, I must have passed 10 runs, but it still hasn't missed once. Anecdotally, it feels like Howden Leo survives for longer than Guam, which she needs to since her debuff requires that she stays alive. By the way, since Guam's debuff is an armor break and Howden Leo's increases HE damage, it's more beneficial to use 3 battleships as opposed to Rume, whereas it doesn't matter as much what you use with Chapayev or Plymouth. Although I think Alsace just does more damage anyway, so there's nothing wrong with using Alsace regardless of what vanguards you're using. Of the fleets I tested, using GVB, Lion, Alsace, Trafalgar, Chapayev, and Eldridge resulted in the highest damage, but I think using Howden Leo to tank was the most comfy personally, and this is what I'll be going with for my dailies, with the double RPG auxiliaries on Eldritch and Trafalgar. Okay, now back to the tier list. In the A tier, Vanguard and Warspite just contribute a lot of damage, but not as much. Vanguard by buffing the stronger S tier ships, and Warspite just on her own. Soyuz is kind of important for her slow if you're going to try a battleship fleet without Eldritch, which is honestly a pretty bad idea, and I don't recommend it unless you missed Eldritch's retrofit item 2 years in a row. Similarly, Enterprise is the only way to get a somewhat consistent invulnerability to remove Bristol's damage reduction without Eldritch, and even that is only a 70% chance that you have to roll 4 times in a row, so it's not recommended even if it works once in a blue moon. The USS Core relies on William D. Porter for damage, and doesn't really care for Eldritch's slow. Since Eldritch is forced for the damage reduction removal, the USS Core deals less damage than the alternatives while not providing any extra survivability, so they're lower down the list compared to the previous light armor meta bosses. Moving on to the A tier vanguards, Drake finds herself in front because she can be used in the same way as Guam or Howden Liu. However, she's a little bit squishier than them, which ends up mattering because her total damage in the fight will be lower when she dies earlier, and she doesn't have the team buffs to compensate. On paper, her survivability should be quite close to them, but it didn't really feel that way. This might just be an oath difference, and also if you use 2 RPG auxiliaries, then I think she's easily good enough to main tank or be slotted in the middle as an alternative to Plymouth or Chapayev, provided you're using GVB as the flagship. Moskva can also be used the same way as Guam and Howden Liu, but her total damage contribution is not as high due to her lack of buffs. I guess if you use her, you can use Rume instead of Alsace, since she reduces the enemy's anti-air by 5%, but it's not going to make a big enough difference to matter. Next up is Helena. You can use her if you don't have access to the higher tier debuffers. She's easy to access and works for all kinds of comps. I'm not sure if there are new players watching these that don't know what Helena does at this point, but she has a powerful debuff that has a 40% chance to not activate each time. Just read her skill and you'll know why she's on the list, but not at the top. Okay, moving on to the B tier now. I tried these battleships and they were strong enough to one-shot the boss alongside GVB and Lion, but their output is not as high as the A tier battleships. For the vanguards, Mogador functions similar to Drake in this fight, just worse both in damage and survivability, but she's serviceable. Hindenburg and Taiyuan are purely damage dealers, and they can't replace the tank or Eldritch, so they're always going to be taking up the middle slot, for which they're just worse than the other middle options like Trafalgar, Chapayev, Plymouth, Helena, and so on. Finally, William D. Porter and Sirius are options you can try with the USS carrier fleets, but similar to Hindenburg and Taiyuan, they're not very strong due to the opportunity cost of using them over Chapayev or Aurora. Lastly, I put Kurumi in this tried tier because I tried using her as the tank, but she wasn't able to sustain enough clones to survive. Okay, that's pretty much it for this Bristol meta tier list as far as the ships I tested. There may be other viable ships. Well, there definitely are, but I haven't gone around to testing them yet. When new ships are added, or if I find another ship that's at least an A tier, I might silently just add them to the list. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.